mass media.
Welcome to the Independent Voter Podcast from Independent Voter Project. We're going to expand a little bit. A new era of independent voter news that the journalists just don't cover. It's where we have these debates on a national level, really taking on issues so that people have more educated disagreements with each other. Let's just explain how the process really works.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Independent Voter Podcast. This is Kara McCormick, and today I'm joined by my colleague Sean Griffiths at Independent Voter News, and also by Steve Peace, who you may or may not know. He's the author of the top 2 nonpartisan primary law in California. He's the co-founder of the Independent Voter Project. He is the former director of finance of the state of California. He was in the state Senate and in the legislature in California for 22 years. And right now he is getting set to release the 5th installment of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Steve, it is so great to see you and exciting to have you on today. And Sean and I want to jump right in and ask you, what is really going on, Steve, with this California governor's race?
Yeah, well, organic intelligence and California government aren't exactly often thought about in the same context. So nobody knows what's happening in the California's governor's race. It's a free for all. There is no leader. Early entries have seen their early numbers cannibalized principally by the entry of a large billionaire, Tom Steyer, who, ironically, in his he spent $30 million in television commercials telling everybody how he's going to get rid of PAC money in campaigns. That's
interesting.
I mean, he's literally outspent the field telling people he's going to get all the money out of politics. And then he, interestingly enough, which is particularly fascinating for me, is he ran commercials attacking utility rates and then suggesting he's going to bring back the Enron model in California to fix the problem, which ought to go over like a lead balloon. But, preliminarily, we had some polling if you go to IVN, you can see the polling. We asked the specific question when he was about 3 or 4 weeks into his TV ads, and he didn't pick up a lot of momentum. He got into low single digits. But the interesting thing was almost all his numbers appeared to come out of the hide of Katie Porter and Eric Swalwell, the 2 congressional members running.
So like those 3 are sort of the more liberal part, or?
I think I think it has more to do with they live in the internet, social media meme space. And then you have Antonio Villaraigosa, who is the former mayor of Los Angeles and Speaker of the Assembly, who I served with in the legislature, who I think is probably the most underspoken about, if you want to say there's a dark horse amongst the Democrats.
Could be him.
Right. You have Mr. Bianco, who's a sheriff or ex-sheriff on the Republican side, the talk show host with the British accent. What's his name?
His name's Steve Hilton. And
Steve Hilton, thank you.
He's in the Epstein files.
Well, it's a mystery to me how the Republicans, at one point, there was a possibility of a former state senator who was a former Democrat, who is Latina, who is bilingual, and does not speak with a British accent to be the candidate. And they thought it was smarter to run the guy who sounds like he's a member of British royalty. And I don't get it. I mean,
do we know that he's not a member of British royalty?
Could be. So, but at any rate, the bottom line is those 2, Hilton and Bianca, are running pretty much in a tie at the lead.
At the lead, right?
At the lead,
this is
right?
Causing a lot of.
They're right. They're running 1 and 2. And that's because there's still more Democrat candidates. Betty Yee, who's the state controller, very experienced, knows government inside and out, but also comes from that same Bay Area that the one Congress member Swalwell comes from, the most recent entry, the mayor of San Jose, Mr. Mahan, who would appear to be the more of the moderate business end. He got very involved in the Prop 36 campaign 2 years ago.
Right.
Right. And
so he's like a tough on crime Democrat, like not sort of a far left Democrat. Is that his positioning?
Yeah, I mean, look,
mayor?
it's Silicon Valley.
Right.
And he was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur himself. So when you look at it from the context of California, Silicon Valley, Northern California, Bay Area politics, he would be the moderate conservative. If you looked at it from the perspective of America, which begins about, let's say, 45, 50 miles inland from the California coast.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what town are we talking here? But once you take it from from the coast,
you got to know the local freeways to sort of the thing. But he's a genuine Democrat, liberal guy, but probably more traditional liberal, probably in what folks in my era would consider. So
he kind of seems a little bit Newsom-esque to me, like, just
he seems like he has the Northern California Silicon Valley look.
But also he has like this new thing going on, which I think that the same thing with Daniel Lurie, these mayors in Northern California who are getting shit done. Like, it's very cool to watch that model kind of.
There's clearly the beginnings of a recognition, at least in some of even here in California, that what I call the no drama lane. That there are voters that are exhausted with the hyperbolic rhetoric. And there's and I don't want to say it's overwhelming or a tsunami or whatnot, but slowly building momentum for, hey, you know what? Is there somebody that just wants to get the job done?
Yes.
And Mahan has clearly embraced that as mayor of San Jose, and he's gotten good marks in general from the public. Now, on the other hand, in running there, he took on organized labor. The woman he defeated for mayor is a part of the organized labor movement, and so there's a lot of bad blood within organized labor in both the mayor of San Francisco, mayor. So these are big cultural movements from within the party structure, and of course, in California, the trajectory of this might be very different in another state. And I think most analysts on a national level, they tend to forget that we have an open primary. So they still go in and they analyze the candidates the same way I just did. They put them in the Republican bucket and the Democrat bucket.
Right, but in California,
you can draw from both. Now we have yet to see a campaign operation in California on a statewide basis actually understand that and actually run campaigns differently. And a lot of that has to do with the inordinate amount of influence the party structures have, the special interest groups have behind the scenes. And there's so much parties still run the political system because 80%, 90% of states still have partisan systems. So the political power and the money is still organized in this, duopoly. And as a consequence, the bread and butter of the consultants is fundamentally rooted in their relationships in national party structures. Even when you are in a large nonpartisan primary state like California, which is what we learned over the last decade and a half, that it's not enough to win it. You got to get to a point where we have a critical mass of nonpartisan primary states until we can have real, genuine reform. Now, having said that, and I don't know that I don't want to have unintendedly. I know I didn't touch base on all the candidates, and there's Javier Becerra.
There's so
former
many.
Secretary of Health is in there.
Yeah. Ian Calderon.
Who's a former majority leader. Interesting because he's by far the youngest candidate, and yet he
the most experience.
Arguably one of the more experienced. A guy who actually walked out before he was term limited, and so there's lots of reasons why somebody could in theory say this candidate could have a message. And of course, at the end, the reality is the money, and which is why everybody's drawn to, okay, what's the Steyer effect going to be on the election? Because he's the only one out there spending, oodles of money. And so I would assume that by the time we get to the filing period, he will have been a couple of months in. He's clearly not running a campaign directed at an understanding of nonpartisanship and the structure of the primary. He's clearly
Are any of the candidates?
no, but no, in fairness,
should.
none of the candidates are actually actively campaigning the way Steyer is. He's really the only one in the field right now. Everybody else is working endorsements and whatnot. I think Steyer just got I think he got the California Medical Association and the nurses.
He did.
Endorsed at Swalwell.
Yes, yesterday,
right?
or day before yesterday.
Right.
Yep.
And so that's meaningful in terms of what the insiders are betting. And make no mistake, these guys don't try to figure out who would be the best governor. They're just guessing on who's going to win. They just want 90% of their narrative, and as long as it's not somebody who is others, there might be people they're hostile to. I'm sure Mahan's going to encounter some elements of organized labor are going to be in the anybody but Mahan bucket because of his previous campaign in San Jose. There'll be a coalition, I suspect, of supporters of other candidates will be in the anybody but Steyer bucket simply because the aversion to the rich guy. And I think, historically, candidates who have spent a lot of money of their own money trying to run for governor in California haven't done well, even
Al Checky,
before. Right?
my wonderful friend Al Checky.
Right. On both sides. I mean, you'll remember, who was it? On the Republican side,
Meg Whitman.
Meg Whitman.
Yeah. I will never forget. I worked on Al Checky's campaign, and I will never forget the ad that Gray Davis made, because Al Checky had oodles of money. He was the former vice chairman of Northwest Airlines. He's just a great guy with some solid ideas on policy, et cetera. But when Gray Davis put up this ad, it said that he had experience that money can't buy. And what a great slogan. It worked like a charm. Yeah. And we went from being in first place to not being in first place anymore as a result of that ad. It's like an example of a political slogan that hits at exactly the right place that it needs to hit, because it's not super negative, right? It's not like Al Checky is a terrible person. It's just that Gray Davis has experience that money can't buy. It's like that underhanded slight.
Well, I suspect that ultimately Steyer is going to be really vulnerable to that, because this is a guy who, if you look at, he's trying to project himself. I've personal bias in politics. I don't care whether you're right, left, medium, in between. The worst thing you can do is, with your own money or somebody else's money, try and project yourself to be somebody you're not. And here's a guy who trying to make it look like he's an outsider. He's going to go clean something up. If you look at the signing ceremony for the bill, the governor's signing it. There's all the the elected officials standing behind him on the re-up of the cap and trade legislation. Steyer is standing in the room behind the governor. That's how material his involvement. He hasn't been an elected official, but he's been the guy funding all these guys. So the money behind all of the things that people are complaining about in California for the last decade or more has been Tom Steyer, and the evidence is in that one picture, which I'm sure we're going to see at some point. So I don't see, bluntly put, Steyer to be he's probably the one Democrat who could actually lose in November to a Republican. And I'm sure that the balance of the Democratic field, there'll be, just as there'll be an anybody but Mahan thing, there'll be an anybody but Steyer operation of some sort. And I just, and it doesn't mean he's a good guy, a bad guy, or a guy. I just think the launching your campaign so disingenuously, what happens is your actual expenditures end up being turned against you the more, and that's what happened, to Checky and these others. They spend so much. Meg Whitman, I remember I wrote an op-ed. I think I wrote it. Well, no, I first wrote this. I wrote a fake legal opinion.
Okay.
That was the legal basis for a lawsuit to be filed by Meg Whitman against her campaign consultants for malpractice.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I
how
mean,
it was
it's
unbelievably bad. I mean, and literally the more she spent, the more she went down. We'll see. I think it's very difficult to take a guess at where that's going to go.
I'm sure we should have more polls, I mean,
Well,
I know we've done a great poll for that you can find on Independent Voter News, ivn.us. You can find our most recent California governor's poll. Where Sean, you want to talk about that for a second? You're so
no,
quiet over there in Chicago.
What I wanted to ask Steve was if, we talk about how a lot of campaigns haven't yet adapted to a nonpartisan system, haven't been willing to or try to adapt to it. But we have seen campaigns trying to outsmart it, say in the last U.S. Senate race where you had the Democratic winner put more money into a Republican campaign than that Republican was able to, putting in ads trying to prop him up to get him into the top 2 spot. Do you think we could see similar shenanigans, or is the race too tight to kind of go with that gamble this time around?
No, look at every gamble that can be taken is ultimately taken because a political consultant figures out that they can make money convincing somebody they should do it. And 90% of the time, political consultants spend baiting wealthy people or candidates into these strategies. It has a little bit to do what's good for the candidate or good for the donor's interest, but it's 90% what's good for the consultant. And
so sad.
And it is sad. It's the most cynical group of ne'er-do-wells that on both sides of the aisle that have ever walked the face of the earth. So you can be certain that every piece of skullduggery and every stupid idea that can be dressed up, like a, what's the saying about pigs and lips?
Lipstick on a pig.
Lipstick on a pig will be tried. Having said that, that's why we came to the conclusion that it's time to reform the reform.
Yeah.
We all learn as we go through these processes, the weaknesses and the strengths and the different things. And I never thought in a million years that we would see a confluence of ranked choice and open primary or nonpartisan primary. But it's very clear that melding and blending the two mitigates against problems that each of them have when they stand alone.
Totally.
The partisan primary inherently feeds divisiveness. It discourages compromise, and compromise is the essence of democracy. When I used to spend a lot of time when I was in office and I'd go to schools and talk with kids, I'd say, I'd ask them about, what they thought about the word compromise. And then I'd go through, so I say, well, look, how many have brothers and sisters? They'd all raise their hand. Do you ever go out to dinner or lunch with your family? Yeah. Well, how do you decide where you're going to go?
Where are you going to go?
You argue about it. Some of these families lived in monarchies where mom or dad said, "This is where we're going."
That's right.
But sometimes they lived in democracies where they yelled at each other and they get and I said, "How do you get there?" Well, we go to my brother's place first, and then I get to pick the next time. Welcome to democracy.
Yeah.
And by definition,
and compromise and
nobody
consensus.
gets everything they want. And once you get to a place where people start insisting they got to have everything they think is right, everything they think is right, the whole system starts to fall apart.
Well, you're talking about the influence of the internet and kind of how, the social media dialogue shapes politics now. And the thing about the example that you're using, after you get into that argument with your brothers and sisters, you got to go and live with them. You got to keep living with them. You have to make up in some way. Whereas on social media, you see people argue. They're never, they don't have to complete the argument. They can keep whatever idea they had in their head the whole time and just walk away and think, well, that guy's an idiot. That guy's a moron. So, it kind of shows you just the art of compromise has been lost.
It's even worse because they go back to the internet and someone will reinforce the notion they were entirely right.
Exactly.
And the person arguing was a total idiot. And so, interestingly enough, learning from folks in the ranked choice space and having experienced some of the problems with ranked choice, to your point, manipulation by consultants being one of the principal ones. And when you have the ability to, in a ranked choice system, to have an unlimited number of candidates, that gives political consultants an unlimited number of scurrilous options to have multiple candidates that behind the scenes they're supporting to either hurt or help another candidate, all kinds of bad stuff that happens. We see it in San Francisco, we see it in Oakland, and people complaining about it on the side. You see New York, where I think
That
you
definitely
guys
never
discussed the
happens
other
in
day.
Maine, Steve. I
Yeah.
gotta say, like that's
Yeah.
that never happens in
Right.
Maine.
So when you layer it with instead, you have the ability to
Open up the
use
primary.
traditional voting in the primary,
Yep.
narrow it down to 4 or 5.
Yep.
Now you're dealing with a manageable groups of people that the public, the voter. And there's a reason why
Totally.
we call it the Independent Voter Project. We're not about independent candidates. We're about voters. And the basic fundamental view that every single person in America has the right to vote and to have a meaningful right to vote. And
Exactly.
when you condition the participation of voting on joining a party or something else, you're diminishing that individual's right to vote. So this is a way to have the person be able to make a rational decision with a limited number of people that they can reasonably rank, that you can hold a number in your head and say, yeah, I think this 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And interestingly enough, I was shocked to learn as we went in and began to work throughout the country with different groups and talk about the different ideas, there's actually hard science that on how our brains function. And when you get past 5, we literally use a different part of our brain to rank things.
To deal.
Which,
Interesting.
so it's
Well,
pure science.
I think it's safe to say that, top 2 in California really set the stage for what's possible in reform. And now you're seeing all these years later that those ideas be built on and expanded. Top 4 in Alaska is showing us what that type of model can do when you have both a nonpartisan primary system mixed with ranked choice voting that then limits and narrows the field, not as much as to 2, but the 4, in the general election, you're seeing all these, cross-partisan, coalitions in the legislature. You're seeing these academic studies come out, really for the first time, see political scientists acknowledge that closed primaries are a suppressive system that keeps, these largely historically, marginalized groups underrepresented and their voices suppressed. And what you see and what they found in Alaska is that these underrepresented groups are coming out and they're voting now that they have more options, now that they have a voice and they have a choice, and they'll show up in the primaries as well as in the general election. So it really does speak though to I think to a road that was started with, top 2 in California.
Yeah, it all started with that, and basically, it was the first break in the first past the post system. Right? That was like the first example of changing the way that we vote and then producing a different result, like producing a different set of incentives. And now it's very cool to see the 2 reforms come together as more powerful, that powerful combination that Catherine Gale talks about in her book, The Politics Industry, which anybody who's listening, you should definitely get a copy of Catherine Gale's book, The Politics Industry, that she co-wrote with Michael Porter. It's a great book about the combination of these 2 reforms and why that's so powerful. So, Steve, moving right along, I really wanted to ask you about what is going on in our country with ICE and with the lack of immigration reform that has now brought us to this point. And, it's pretty bad situation. You have the federal government officers have killed 2 Americans in Minneapolis in the past month. And everybody's seen it, just Ethan, I think we're up to something like 6.2 million views on our website.
Yeah, we got a lot of views on the videos that came out of what happened with everything, and that's just because they were truly shocking, right? I mean, it was a truly
the whole thing was truly shocking, and to me, what was shocking was to be able to see what I could see with my own eyes. We've talked about this before, but then to have the federal government stand up and say that something completely different happened. And I don't know, Steve, you're a little older than I am, but can you remember? Is there precedent for this kind of like straight up like was it like this with Kent State?
Yes.
Okay, so you probably were how old were you when
Look,
Kent State happened?
I'm at the bottom edge of the Vietnam era
Okay.
generation, and for those of us of our age, really, our political viewpoints were one way or the other framed irreconcilably by the Vietnam experience. Everything we look at is still rooted in having seen and grown up, and rightly or wrongly. And so hold on to that word rightly or wrongly for a moment too, because to Evan's point about, the reality is the eyes that each folk look at these terrible consequential events. What's different is where people start in their analysis of why we got to that circumstance. You could reach back to why are people in the street to begin with. You can go back to why are the public policies what they are today. You can go back to what was the prior administration's policy. So if someone starts with the argument that we have a bunch of people that were let in and shouldn't have been here in the first place, and they start there, and then you look at the dominoes that fall, they'll come to different conclusions based upon what their own biases are and their own viewpoints. And no matter how much, and I think we have to give all parties a little more slack in the notion that they aren't approving of behaviors, right? But they're frustrated with why circumstances are created where those outcomes could occur. Now, I personally, again, because of my thing, I have a problem with, and I'm conflicted on this because I totally understand why. And I'm on a personal level worry about the ICE officers that I understand why they want masks, but I just have a problem with the idea of anybody in law enforcement wearing a mask. Okay. So I start out with a bias when I look and I say, oh, those are officials of the government wearing masks. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Now that means I'm going to be in a biased position, and I got to be careful about myself. Now I also sit there and I look at who the heck goes to a protest and wears a gun, for crying out loud? Who puts themselves and the people around them in that position? It's not okay, right? And then you learn more about the background, why people are there. And I know, a lot of stuff. So I get everybody's argument, but let me just step back. And what's frustrating in my perspective, I think most people outside of politics, their viewpoint on this whole immigration issue is far closer than what the people in the political space think.
I hope you're right.
I think people, conservative, liberal, whatever, want to get the criminals out. And I think they think we can chew gum and walk at the same time.
We should be able
We should be able to get the criminals out, and we should be able to also, at the same time, begin rational amnesty programs that look at the reality that there are people in the community who have demonstrated not only no criminal inclination, but just the opposite over a period of time.
Exactly.
And are some of our things. But why aren't we there? You can also see in Trump's behavior that he has personal differences of opinion with how his own administration has exercised. Yeah. And you see him trying to measure how much slack his base is going to allow him. He's chomping at the bit to pivot on this stuff. And somebody's holding him back. I don't know those players and anything. But he's got to know that all of this bad behavior has stepped on his own message. He's out here, trying to do things that he thinks are important, and we can debate later whether they're right or wrong or should be important, but it's clearly not what he wants people to be talking about, right? So, and even if you don't give him any benefit of public interest thinking, self-interest.
Yeah, I was going to say, right? It's his reputation,
self-interest
right?
would not want him to be in this space, okay? So the one thing that's different about the politics of today and the politics that era I lived in, the pace of things is so much faster. So everything we're talking about today could be irrelevant in a week. And you don't know where things are going to move on Iran. You don't know where things are going to move on Ukraine. You don't know where things are going to move on Venezuela. You don't know where things are going to move on the recent appointment to the Federal Reserve. And all of this
Greenland,
has impact.
like,
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
tariffs.
there used to
You
be
know.
there used to be a time in the media where a news story, any given news story, had a shelf life of 72 hours.
Yeah.
Now it has a shelf life of 12 hours. Maybe,
we used to
you know.
always talk about that, like
Yeah.
depending on what we would, find in our work.
Yeah.
Like the story has legs. If a story has legs, we would hope that a bad story would
Right.
have legs
So-
over day after day after day.
So let me connect that immigration question and the inability of, call it the Republican side, to get to a place which rationally shouldn't have been that difficult for them to get to.
No, they were
But for
winning. They were
political-
winning on
for
this
political,
issue.
Well, it's hard for me to believe they thought that so-called winning was sustainable. This was foreseeable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
When you were approaching it this way, it was entirely foreseeable, and you should have been able to foresee it wouldn't be in your political interest for it to happen, regardless of what you thought. But this
Good
is the
point,
this is
Steve.
the
That's a good
tension
point.
that occurs as a result of partisan primary systems. This is systemically generated. The people on both sides who, on one side, like, for example, does anybody believe abolish ICE is the rational thing? You might, maybe rename ICE. Right? But are you going to not enforce immigration at all? Is that really rational? And haven't the Democrats gone down that path? So let me jump to an issue that may seem totally unconnected, but it's totally connected. Voter ID.
Right.
Now, just like I believe you find 80% of the country supports a rational walk and chew gum at the same time approach on immigration, clearly 80% of the country supports voter ID. But in the political space, you put any politically active people and they decide they'll kill each other over it, right? And they're killing each other over a narrative that is rooted in an arcane world of many decades ago, in which identification was fundamentally different, and our intersection with ID
Meaning,
was fundamentally different
like,
than it is
explain
today.
that. Like, just try to explain that to me.
Yeah.
Like, because now it's just ubiquitous.
ID,
like
the
everyone
notion of
has an ID.
IDs, even in the middle to latter part of the 20th century, IDs were used in many states to keep people from being able to vote, and because people, in particular blacks in the South, wouldn't have IDs necessarily. They didn't need to have an ID. That's not the world we live in today. In fact, the physical possession of ID is highest amongst the lowest economic folks in the
Isn't that
community,
interesting?
because
Okay,
they have to ID to work, to participate in social programs, a whole variety of things. The ID is now ubiquitous, and it's an absurd application of a world that no longer exists.
Something like a world from 50
Right.
years ago,
But
you're saying.
But this reason why I raise this issue is this. And it's like everything else. You can draft things, and we're going to have a measure on the ballot in California,
Right.
and on voter ID. And if it weren't for the cultural bias I just articulated, this initiative, interestingly enough, was drafted so carefully that I would say this is the voter ID measure that the ACLU would write. That's how
Interesting.
carefully it was written. Now, and it was written by right-wing Republican folk, right, who believe that there is illegal activity, non-eligible voters participating. And if you read the media, everybody will say there's no proof of that, whatnot. The counter argument would be, well, yeah, because you can't prove it because there's no real chain of custody and because you don't have things like ID, blah, 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 blah. So look, as a Democrat, I kind of shake my head and look at it from the perspective of, this is exhausting. Let's, just call the bluff. If it's true,
Call the
we
bluff.
have no breed, if it's true that there's not a bunch of people voting that shouldn't be voting, and presumptively it is true, then what are you worried about? Right? Just like Republicans should have been able to foresee the consequence of an overreach in terms of basic civil liberty and basic law enforcement
Right.
rules.
Need to have a warrant.
And putting Border Patrol officers up into Minnesota as opposed to ICE officers. It's interesting that you'll note that most of these overreaches are not actually ICE. They're Border Patrol folks who are trained differently, and they're not accustomed to being in this environment. And look, the argument that the president's now making and Republicans are making, and Democrats may rue the day that they held up the DHS funding, because now you're going to have a spotlight on sanctuary state and sanctuary city policies. Okay. Now in California, our state law, I think, is pretty rational, pretty reasonable. It makes a distinction between court judicial warrants versus administrative warrants. There's two kinds of warrants that can be issued in order to have the right to go and arrest somebody who's here.
What about
illegally.
to get inside their home or something?
Well, that's what I'm going to get to.
Okay.
So an administrative warrant, it doesn't go before a judge. Okay. In California, we require a court warrant in order to get a person. Let's start before we get to people's homes. Let's talk about jails. Okay.
Okay.
The fundamental difference of opinion in the fight Homan is having is say, look, when you have these sanctuary city laws that don't hand criminals over to us when they've completed their term, and we go and we pick them up in the jail. That's where most of the time it used to be. These guys would be picked up in the jail. They'd never be released. They serve their time. They're handed over to ICE. They're deported. In California, we had a law that was called sanctuary state law, but it very carefully allowed where there was a judicial warrant, and it still allows, where there's a judicial warrant for ICE to keep that person in the jail. What it didn't allow is an administrative warrant. And the administrative warrant isn't looked at by a third party. It's processed inside those ICE offices. And that's the law in California. But we have cities and counties who've gone beyond that and said, we're not going to allow you to come in even if you have a judicial warrant. Now, the most recent articulation and discussion has been this new policy adopted by ICE or Homeland Security where they're using this notion, and no one has done this before. This is testing new law, and I think the court will never allow this. The notion that you can enter a private a home with an administrative warrant.
Right.
I would bet my bottom dollar that the Supreme Court, and ironically, particularly this Supreme Court, this conservative Supreme Court, is less likely to approve of that than a liberal court would. Okay,
yeah.
So that issue is going to resolve itself, and it's still another example of stupid overreach. It doesn't even fit their and I don't know why these guys are pushing so hard in this. And they were, as you point out, they were winning the narrative early. Right.
This is how he got elected,
correct.
Second time.
But now the Democrats are in their weird compulsion to overreact rather than nobody seems to want to embrace the land of rationality. It's like they're allergic to it. Oh, they made a mistake. Let's go out and make a bigger mistake, right? So that we can keep battling like a ping pong match because I'm stupider than you are.
You're exactly right. It's like they're throwing up the lob to the next guy. Because when you say abolish ICE, now you have the people on the other side.
When you go in and you ask everyday people, that they may say, I support sanctuary city. But when you say to them, do you believe your sanctuary city policy should deny the ability of an ICE officer to get somebody out of the jail, right, who is a convicted felon in the country illegally, and a judge has said, this is the right guy, and you go get him. Would you rather have them get him in jail, or do you want him released, and then they got to chase him around to find him? That's the choice. It's, do you want to have him find him in your park at the Builder's Emporium at the school, or do you want him to pick him up in jail? And you have that conversation with 99% of real folks, as opposed to those of us involved in the political space. They go, oh, really? That's what they're arguing? Of course. if a bad guy and a judge has said they're supposed to and they're due to be, yes, why are we doing it? They think this is stupid. But
Common
here we
sense.
have, and look, and we have to the credit of the legislature and the governor in California, we had a rational sanctuary policy, which said, look, number one, we're not going to have our local police officers participate as immigration officers. And there's a
Right.
practical reason for that, because we don't get cooperation in our communities, and it actually helps the bad
Hurts.
guys, right? It hurts.
Exactly.
And so we don't want to get into that space.
No.
And the federal enforcement officers and the police folk, they were okay with that. Most of those cops don't want to be. That's not their job. It's not what they're hired to do. That doesn't mean they're hostile to each other. It doesn't mean they're, quote, uncooperative. It just means they don't act as active federal enforcers of the law. Okay.
Right.
And the next stage is, okay, when do we as a state physically hand people over? And I think the one place everybody could agree is in a jail cell where the guy's been convicted, served his time, and a judge has said that person has been ordered to be deported from the country.
This is very, very reasonable there.
Well, and I
right?
feel like that's a
we
good...
have cities who are saying, nope, even where a judge says that, we're going to let that guy out of the street. Then we're going to complain when we get a confrontation, right? And I bet you 90% of the people who are protesting it don't even know that distinction in the law.
Oh,
Well, and I
certainly
think
not.
that would help, especially with the administration who said it initially started out saying we're only going to, deport the most violent of them, right? We're only going to deport the actual criminals and not focus on, the average person who's just trying to make a living, right? Because for me,
or the 5-year-old.
Right. And so, like, if you do that, if you're actually taking them from the jail, then you're making that distinction between the migrants who are here just trying to make a better life for themselves versus the violent hardened criminals that Trump ran on as wanting to deport and get out of here.
And look, the reason probably the Republicans' hair is on fire on this is that they're looking at it through political lens, not a cultural lens and not a business lens. Their political lens tells them that the Democrats have a grand scheme to bring lots of people into the country, naturalize them, and then have voter advantage. Now, Trump has said enough publicly about DACA and about farm workers and about hotel workers to know he actually at least also looks to the other scheme, but he's been clearly convinced that there's a bunch of votes at stake, right? And the Republicans see this inability to win the math. I think, again, just like the Democrats are miscalculating on voter ID, I think if you look at history and you look at immigrants, you asked about Vietnam, one of the more reliable Republican group of voters in California
is Vietnamese.
Yeah. And that's because Richard Nixon was president when the Vietnamese escaping the communist takeover of South Vietnam came to the country.
That's when they came to California. That's when they came.
And that's like
what these guys are missing is the moment they pivot and they sponsor the naturalization of citizenship for the millions of, in particular, Mexican and South American immigrants. A huge chunk of those folks are going to become Republicans. It'll be competitive. And the longer they fight it,
they're
the worse.
literally going to naturalization ceremonies, right?
And that was
Sean?
the thing. Like, I never really understood the Republican narrative here, because when you look at the Latino population, a lot of them are independent voters. And a lot of them are independent voters that lean conservative, right? They are very likely to vote for Republicans just as much as they are Democrats in some instances, which, again, it would end up benefiting the Republican Party to have a system that makes it more efficient and easier for some of these people to obtain legal status here in the United States.
Absolutely. Okay, so I wanted to talk about one more thing before we go, Steve, which is the ballots that got seized in Fulton County, Georgia, this week. There's 700,000 ballots. The FBI went in. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, was there. There was a state senator who witnessed the whole FBI raid of Fulton County elections, and it's gotten 2 or 3 million views, I think, on our website. Is that right, Ethan?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This
2
state
million.
senator saying, "What the hell are you doing here? Like, why? How are you taking these ballots?" So basically, I think Trump is still trying to prove that he didn't lose the 2020 election. And I'm just curious what you think about like the federal government seizing these ballots. Like, do you think they have pictures of them all? Like,
I have no problem with it whatsoever. I think
okay.
this is a classic. I mean, again, what are you worried about?
I'm
What are you
worried
about?
about what if that they took the ballots and
look,
they're still looking for these 11,000 votes.
They will. Well, what if they find them?
But
is that what you're worried? They might find them?
Well,
I mean,
I'm worried about them not trusting that they weren't lost to begin with, because
the FBI has unlike the absentee ballot process, which once you separate here's the core of this argument, okay? As long as we have it's one thing when you have a relatively small number of mail-in ballots relative to the overall election, but when they become the predominant, and this is why it became so difficult in the COVID year voting, because everybody's voting.
This is the year we're talking about, right? 2020.
Exactly right. And you have states who were just for the first time in large scale involved in these things.
Yes,
and
for
there
sure.
may or may not have been issues, but once you separate the envelope from the ballot, and the chain of custody process is pretty weak, and that's the core of the fundamental argument. And remember, I'm the guy who ran one of the campaigns for the very first all-mail ballot, MAIL, campaign in the history of the country. And I can tell you, even back then, there was bad stuff that went on, okay? And I mean, picking up the ballots, you say, Mrs. Jones, have you voted? What's voting? You got, see that envelope over there? Could you just sign that over there?
But
blah,
okay,
blah, blah.
okay, I get that. But what about
so let me go to the point. I've not gotten to the point of lost so much value that I believe that civil servant FBI sworn officers are not going to follow the rules in terms of chain of evidence. So the thing to worry about with this raid is, would they take the ballots and alter them in some way? Okay, that's what I meant by saying, what are you worried about?
Yeah.
That's it. And if we're at a place where
we think,
under any administration, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the FBI is not going to properly document evidence that they seize, even if they are being directed for bias reasons to try and go find something. If we're at that place, we're beyond recovery.
So
right?
do you think the raid is more performative?
I don't think they know. I don't think they know. I think they believe, and I don't know the truth. You don't know. I mean, one of the things I most object to is when press says that these things about elections have been disproven. Nothing's been disproven. And they'll say, well, of course it's been disproven because they've been in 50 courts and
60.
all of them, and 60 courts, and they've all thrown them out. Well, guess what? The reason they're thrown out is either because the court has ruled that they didn't have standing, which has nothing to do with the merits of the case.
Correct.
Or there's the nature of how the elections were run could not produce the evidence to be said. They've never been allowed to get beyond that. And so,
oh, really?
I don't know.
I have no
reason. I have no reason to know or believe, and I certainly hope that it would find that there is nothing there. And I would hope that this is all conspiracy theory. But it's in all of our interests from a public perspective to let them go get the ballots and look at them and then verify them. I
hope they have photographs.
I think ultimately, though, the danger with these conversations,
they have to document that. That's if they don't. They won't get 2 feet through a courtroom if they haven't documented and maintained that documentation all the way through. So your check on that is the courtroom. They can't do anything without getting into a courtroom, and they're going to have to prove. They're a long way. And look, they also, remember, they would not have been able to go get those ballots if they had not gone into a court and gotten a
Somebody
court order.
gave them permission. Yeah.
Correct. They
Yeah.
had enough evidence, and we don't know
And
what
it's
that is.
criminal evidence too, right?
Correct.
So it would have to be a crime.
Which also to the question of why was Tulsi Gabbard there? You know, the speculation is that there is something connected to the narrative presented to the court about foreign involvement.
It would have to be, right? Because she doesn't really have jurisdiction over.
Correct.
I think this is a case where, just like it was with the ICE raids, just like it is with a lot of issues, and we've talked about already, is that this is why it's important to just take a breath and figure out what's going on. Because the danger with the narrative is that the knee-jerk reaction has been, oh, well, now, the federal government's trying to take over elections and try to control this and that. And we published in IVN how this is impossible. The Constitution makes it so that the states control how elections function. And so the federal government can't take it over. Trump can't take it over. He can't cancel elections, right? Despite what this knee-jerk narrative is post what's happening in Georgia. And so this to me is just another good example why we just need to take a breath and evaluate the situation for it is and wait for
Sean, to your point, the Democrats know full well that nobody's taking over elections. Nobody's going to cancel elections. So why is that narrative? Because they're raising money off of it.
Right.
This is, if this was not politics, the way both the Republicans and Democrats raise money, go look at, I get all the emails. I get all the solicitations. If you were in the private sector and you were running a business or a nonprofit organizations and you were engaging in the kind of behavior that the political parties and the political consultants and the politicians themselves routinely engage in for the purposes of raising money, you'd be in jail, literally, because you're lying to people in order to take their money. And most of the money they're taking is from small donors and people who can't afford to have the money stolen from them. And that's exactly what they're doing. I have absolute contempt for the way both sides raise money these days. They scare people. They use fear in order to take money literally from little old ladies. And that's what's really going on. And Trump plays the game, and he salts the narrative on purpose. It took me a while to figure out, why would he say that? But he knows, he baits them into saying, he says things like national takeover elections because he knows that, the money grubbing establishment on the other side will take the most absurd interpretation of his absurd statement. And I think he consciously makes absurd statements just to bait them into going over here. And if you look at read his book, what is it?
The Art of the Deal.
Art of the Deal, right. It's always about making some outsized absurd demand, right? To
100%
change the perception of where the middle is, okay? And if you think about how he uses that thought process to purposely say something he knows is over the top. You and I, we would all think, look, we don't want to say something like that because we'd be ashamed to be associated with saying something, quote, like that, right? But if you like you have no shame, you go out and you say, and it's pure, the other side is going to overreact. It gives you more room to not have to, when you ultimately get to compromise, to not have to give as much. That's the same reason why I think Trump right now is probably very unhappy with his people who have been orchestrating the ICE strategy. He's got to know they've overreached and they've damaged his ability, right, to seek a middle ground ultimately on these things that is most, akin to or where he wants to land. And on the other hand, who knows? Maybe privately he has even more disagreement with these people than we might think. Maybe he's happy. He'll run over there and talk to Schumer and cut a deal that looks more like what Democrats want done on immigration. Maybe it gives him enough cover now to go and say, you know what, we need an amnesty program.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll watch it all play out, and it keeps coming at us faster and faster. Before we go
back to Sean's point, though, I want to go back. Sean, the most important thing said today
Take a breath.
Take a breath. Exactly.
Take a breath.
So when you see on these, let this whole election. Trump is obsessed with, on a personal level, the 2020 election. Okay,
he can't believe that he actually lost.
Correct. So, but let's let it go. Let him. the system will call the bluff one way or the other. Maybe we'll ultimately learn that we're either going to learn that obsession is exactly what it was, and the evidence now will be pointing, and this will take years. It's not going to take months. Right. And but we may also find that there's something other thing, and two things can be true at once. Trump could have lost the election, and there could have been a lot of illegal stuff done, which is, given the numbers, my guess is that's what if it was the whole thing was opened, we're going to find that there's a lot more bad stuff going on in elections than Democrats want to admit, because it just objectively, mail balloting is more vulnerable to fraud than in-person ballot. It's just
I was going to ask
fact.
you, Steve, what happens with voter ID in California? Because don't most of you just get a ballot mailed to your house there?
Yes, and that's
so. Then, are you supposed to show your ID to the mailman, or?
In effect, I mean, there's a process delineated in the initiative and verification of that ID with your ballot, and you provide a driver's license number, and there's when
you go to turn it in.
Correct.
Okay.
And there's a whole list of alternatives.
So you can't just mail your ballot back.
You do, but you provide the information of your identification coterminously. And there's a very, very large number of things that constitute ID. You don't have to have a driver's license, utility.
So you would write your driver's license number on the ballot itself.
It's not a citizenship verification. It's not a thing. All it is ascertaining. It's more about, think about it more about making sure there's only one ballot. Put aside
per number,
whether people
per
are eligible.
person,
Let's assume everybody's eligible, including those that are not technically eligible. And look, I can tell you from personal experience, walking door to door, I don't know, it was 2020, 2020, 2018 or whatever, in the San Diego State area near the college in San Diego State, and encountering a home where the mail was arriving, right? And there was literally more than 40 pieces of mail stuffed
ballots
in a mailbox.
Yeah.
And it was political mail, right?
Yeah, sure.
And
all the flyers that people send out, the mailers.
It was so much that it was spilled out, and it was on the porch, right? I'm looking there, and I see Charles C. Jones getting mail from the Republican Party. C or J, whatever, different variation of the same name.
Right, over and over,
Democratic
but different
mail.
names. So
they're getting, clearly somebody had registered as a Republican, a Democrat, and a nonpartisan using different variations of their name at the same address and was getting mail, right?
So that means that they're also maybe getting 3 ballots or 5 ballots, you're saying?
It absolutely means they're getting 3 ballots.
That's bad.
It's absolutely, undeniably true that we have in California. But the question is how much? Is it statistically significant? There are people who cheat. My mother died almost 10 years ago. She got her ballot 4 years ago. I keep notifying the registrar that she's no longer with us, but every year I get a ballot. I don't vote it, but what would happen if I did vote? It'd get counted.
Yeah, of course
right?
it would. Of course it would.
Some of these are honest mistakes. Some of these are over-enthusiastic, energized. This is probably a college student who feels he's doing, he's helping the cause by voting 3 or 4 times, right? Is my guess.
It's very illegal.
Right. But you got to look at, this goes back to a whole nother part where you talk about the culture and the decline of ethics in the culture more broadly. And it's unrealistic to expect that in a culture in which sense of ethical obligation is declining, the sense of personal shame is declining. It's unrealistic to think that hasn't infected our politics. So it is absolutely ridiculous to argue that we don't have some modicum of ballots that are being distributed and voted that shouldn't be. Now, is it statistically significant? I have no idea, and I hope it's not. And the only way we'll ever know is to have voter ID. Call their bluff.
I mean, it kind of goes into that. Again, the way that the system defines the narratives is either you have to wholly accept Trump's claim of widespread fraud, or you have to pretend like this stuff never happens and that nobody would ever do anything nefarious, even though we know with things like ballot harvesting in California, that does raise the potential for fraud. It does. And then there's a case out in North Carolina where a election had to be done over again because of ballot tampering. So we know it happens. It's just, is it happening to the degree that it's being claimed, or, you know?
Karen and I both go far enough back in California politics, and just like politics everywhere, as much of California historically had such a relatively clean reputation in terms of politics. You know, we all know the stories of San Francisco, where the last reporting precinct included the largest cemetery in town. And Willie Brown used to joke about they had to report it last because they didn't know how many of those graves
that they needed. I remember that now.
Right?
Oh my
It's
gosh.
a story that Willie told over and over again.
Willie, it is.
You know, we all remember the term "walking around money."
Sure we do.
Right?
Sure.
And that's when cash was allowed to be spent in campaigns, and you had cash handed out to people, and you didn't know to what purpose they put out, but that was get out the vote. That was what get out the vote was. So we suddenly believe that if you go and we know, and we read in the history books about Tammany Hall and all the things that have happened. We know the history of the presidential election between Kennedy and Nixon, and what happened in Illinois and what happened in Chicago. I was in the room when Al Gore made what I believe to be the most terrible speech in his life, when he
selfless
refused,
and terrible.
when he refused to continue challenging the results in Florida. He did the right thing for the country.
I know,
and he knew he won, and he did win, and he also recognized that if he challenged it and he went to the court and won, it would be terrible for the country, and we'd never heal. And let me tell you the most interesting backstory about that. There was a young lawyer who walked out of that room. I was standing right there, and I watched Al Gore put his arm around him. And this young lawyer was, and I'm trying to remember the name because it'll be very, he was just beside himself. He had done all the legal work, making the argument to go in front of the court.
Yes.
Do you know who that young lawyer is? He's the exact same older lawyer many years later that wrote all of the strategy work and the legal briefs for Donald Trump's campaign, in which they were going to challenge that 2020 election.
You're kidding. That would be a great story.
The same lawyer.
Interesting.
Same guy. And he looks at it through the lens of a lawyer. And it isn't about, you say, well, how could a guy who is a Democrat,
because
how could he
looks through it as a lawyer.
As a lawyer. And he's still mad. He's still pissed off about, as a young lawyer, having written this brilliant brief that would have made Al Gore president of the United States. And this was his chance to finally win his legal argument in front of the Supreme Court. So obviously Al was not as convincing as I had hoped he was on the walk out of that room in understanding the broader ethical. There's a difference between being right, wrong, and the ethics of something. And Al Gore knew the ethical thing to do was to give it up, and that in the long term, the country would be better off.
So what's up with the killer tomatoes on the Midway, Steve? I heard it sold out in 3 hours.
3 hours, yeah.
I mentioned at the beginning of the show that Steve is the executive producer of the 5th installment of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes: Organic Intelligence. And tell us about the Midway. What's going on there? They're going to have the premiere?
Well, it's a pre-release private showing for a good cause. There's the USS Midway is actually the largest tourist attraction now in San Diego.
I believe it.
It's a wonderful experience if people haven't had a chance to be there. Part of the obligation that the San Diego Port District had when they were allowed to place the ship there, which was, believe it or not, controversial back then, because environmental folks were worried about blocking views of the bay and whatnot. So I was in the legislature at the time, that we required that as a condition of locating it there, that a public park be built in place of what is now a parking lot and a warehouse. So the warehouse has been torn down, and they're ready to go and build 20 some years later, the public park. And so the proceeds from the event on February 20th are part of the fundraising effort to fund the Freedom Park, and that'll be located there next to it. I mean, it did it. So, I had my money on the bet 3 days. It turned out I had the 3 right.
You were wrong. You had the 3 right.
Yeah. So, which, is great. And look,
because it's really like a cult classic. It's like the definition of a cult classic, right?
It's a testimony to the fact it's better to be lucky than good.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you as someone who quite frequently communicates with like the horror community space and the space of people who love these type of movies, they're looking forward to this new Killer Tomatoes movie coming out. I mean, they still talk about the old movies. They still love them. Having a conversation the other day from someone who brought up the product placement scene from the Return movie, from the second movie, which is a classic. It's great.
Well, I hope so. I mean, look, we hope it's hard. What we're doing is hard, because we're trying to hang on to that cult genre, and at the same time broaden the reach. There's no reason to do something you're trying to broaden the reach. So I don't know. We'll never know. People always ask, you think nobody knows why movies are successful or unsuccessful, and so I don't know. The most important thing is it's just a fun time. It's about suspending reality a bit. Don't take things too seriously. A way to look at life with a sense of humor. It's parody. It's not satire. It's funny. I often read even about the original. I go back and people have these long treatises about what lessons.
It means.
Yeah, what it means. News to me. But I can tell you what it means. It means lighten up.
Yeah. Like we don't have to be so serious all the time about everything. Right now, it sure feels like we're supposed to be. I have to say, like, the way that the news comes at us, and thank goodness for the attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and for a few hours, I wish you all the best. Just suspend everything that you're so worried about, and just go watch this great movie.
I hope so. That's all. That's the purpose. It's just a fun time.
It's definitely much needed. Well, thanks for being with us today, Steve. You're a wonderful co-host, and Sean, it was good to see you. Ethan's great to always hear your voice. Someday maybe you'll be on camera with us, and
I will. I'll be making an appearance.
Thank you to all of our listeners, and to Lena, to our producer. And make sure that you go to ivn.us to read the latest news from Independent Voter News, and you can like or subscribe on YouTube. And thanks for everything. We'll see you next Thursday.
And subscribe. Like and subscribe.
Okay, like and subscribe. I'm way too old to be doing this, Ethan. This has got to be your part of the show.
Of course.
Well, we're gonna let Ethan on camera as soon as it becomes publicly known that he's actually a tomato.
Oh, okay. Yes, it's true. It's true. You got me.
The tomatoes were pulling the strings all along.
All along.
That's right. All right. We'll catch you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
This is the Independent Voter Podcast, sponsored by the Independent Voter Project and produced by OLAS Media. Remember, you can always find the Independent Voter Podcast or the How It Really Works series at ivn.us. Follow and subscribe at olasmedia.com.
OLAS Media.